A flight attendant tried to drag a black CEO out by his collar, but he ended up dragged down the aisle himself, with 32 passengers filming every second. He tried to drag the black CEO out by his collar, thinking no one would intervene. He didn't know 32 passengers were ready to capture every moment. Subscribe if you believe arrogance always gets broadcast in real time. The tray table clicked into place with a subtle snap as Darian Kessel adjusted his posture in the wide first-class seat. He exhaled, steady and calm, letting the aircraft's ambient murmur settle into the background. The cabin around him gleamed in soft ambient lighting, with pale leather seats and polished trim that projected an illusion of professionalism. One Darian didn't fully trust. As he lifted his tablet to review the final briefing documents for his upcoming negotiations, movement caught the corner of his eye. A flight attendant stood nearby, frozen for a beat too long. The man's name tag read Corvin Reddar. His posture was stiff, but it was his expression that struck Darian. A tightened jaw, narrowed eyes, and a stare that lingered with the kind of weight people use when trying to make others feel out of place without speaking. Darian didn't react. Not yet. He had been watched before, judged before, and succeeded anyway. He tapped his screen, scrolling to his annotated schedule for the week. Johannesburg, Tokyo, Sao Paulo, Berlin. A global expansion deal that could redefine safety infrastructure for major urban centers. This flight wasn't personal. It was business. Or at least it should have been. Corvin moved down the aisle, but not smoothly. He passed other passengers with a flick of acknowledgement, offering polite greetings and curt nods. Yet when he circled back toward Darian, his behavior shifted. Without any announcement, he reached toward the overhead bin, pretending to adjust luggage that didn't need adjusting. His elbow dipped too far, brushing Darian's shoulder. "Excuse me," Corvin muttered, just low enough that only Darian could hear the tone underneath, irritation disguised as indifference. Darian didn't look up. "You're fine," he replied, his voice measured, his gaze steady on the screen in front of him. He felt the atmosphere change again a moment later. Corvin, now standing directly beside him, looked down at the seatbelt with manufactured scrutiny. He reached toward it. "Seat check," Corvin said. "Need to make sure all restraints are secured properly before taxi." Darian calmly fastened his seatbelt, which had been already secured. "It's been fastened since I sat down," he said, not with confrontation but with clarity. Corvin didn't respond. He simply leaned closer, inspecting the buckle as if searching for a reason to intervene. Darian's posture remained relaxed, but his mind was beginning to sharpen. This wasn't about a seatbelt. Not really. A young man, maybe 15 or 16, sitting across the aisle with his father, tilted his phone subtly. Darian caught the motion in his peripheral vision. The camera was pointed directly at Corvin. "Dad," the boy whispered, just loud enough for nearby Rose to hear. "Why's that flight attendant only checking him?" The father said nothing, but the silence added weight. A few heads turned. A businessman too rose up, glanced over his shoulder, frowning. Corvin stepped away, but only briefly, returning moments later holding a small handheld scanner. "Need to verify this seat matches your boarding pass," he said, holding out his hand. "May I see your ticket?" "It was scanned already when I boarded," Darian replied, still calm, still composed. "Need to recheck." "System glitch," Corvin said, though he didn't ask the same of anyone else in the row. Darian unlocked his tablet and displayed the digital boarding pass. Corvin leaned in, staring not at the barcode but at Darian's name and photograph. There was a flicker in his eye, something judgmental, something personal. Corvin looked back at the seat number, then back at Darian. "Ha!" he murmured. "Interesting. Doesn't match the typical profile." Darian finally looked up, his eyes steady. "Excuse me, I just meant—" Corvin paused, smirking faintly as if testing how far he could push. "You don't look like the kind of passenger we usually get in this seat." The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. Around them, silence stretched and thickened. The rustle of magazines stopped. The ambient buzz of quiet conversation faded. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," Darian said evenly, holding up the boarding pass on his screen again. 1A. Same as printed. Same as scanned. Corvin didn't respond. He stepped back slowly, eyes still narrowed, as if weighing his next move. The teenage passenger across the aisle zoomed in on his recording. A low whisper spread among the first-class section. One man muttered, "Is this really happening?" Another answered, "Someone needs to tell the captain." Darian sat upright, his body still, his mind moving fast. This wasn't about a misunderstanding. This wasn't about protocols or boarding glitches or seat assignments. This was something deeper, uglier. He recognized the signs. He'd learned to read them early in his career. The sidelong looks, the intrusive mistakes, the quiet language meant to provoke without accountability. Still, he would not be moved. Not yet. Corvin lingered for a moment longer, then finally turned and walked away, but not far. He hovered near the front galley, speaking in low tones to another attendant whose expression flickered with discomfort before looking away. Whatever Corvin was saying, it wasn't casual. Darian stared ahead, pulse steady, jaw locked. His fingers moved across his tablet screen again, but his eyes weren't reading anymore. They were calculating. He would not speak unless forced. He would not rise unless required. But he knew this was only the beginning. Something was coming. And when it arrived, it would no longer be about boarding passes or aircraft etiquette. It would be about principle. It would be about posture. It would be about the line. And that line was already in view. Darian understood that this conflict was no longer about seating. It was about dignity. Step aside. The words hit Darian's ears with the sharpness of a blade, slicing through the hum of conversation and the soft whir of the cabin air. Corvin Reddar stood rigid in the aisle, his posture stiff, arms locked at his sides like a man desperate to project control. His voice had shifted, no longer the superficially polite tone from earlier, but now something edged, something unmistakably hostile. His eyes bore down on Darian with a gaze that ignored reason and fixated instead on authority, or at least the illusion of it. "I've already scanned your documents, sir," Corvin added, though the way he said "sir" made it sound more like an insult than a formality. "But I need to verify again. It's procedure." Darian didn't move. He turned slightly in his seat, still holding his tablet, his brow furrowing just enough to convey quiet defiance without provoking escalation. His voice was calm, deliberate. "You confirmed my credentials when I boarded. Everything is in order." The tension in the surrounding rows began to rise like the pressure in a sealed cabin. A few passengers looked up from their screens. Others tilted their heads, pretending not to watch but clearly listening. 2 rows behind, a man in a navy blazer, Joran Vale, slowly tilted his phone upward, beginning to record. The subtle click of camera lenses became the new soundtrack beneath the steward's rising voice. "You're holding up the cabin," Corvin declared loudly, stepping closer. But it wasn't true. Boarding had long since completed. Every other passenger was seated. The overhead bins were shut. The doors were closed. The only thing not in motion was the man now standing in front of Darian, creating the very delay he blamed on someone else. Darian's mind worked quickly. His objective was no longer just reaching his destination. It was preserving dignity without letting the situation spiral into chaos. He had already noticed Corvin's fixation, the unnecessary seat checks, the not-so-subtle glances. But this was different. This was targeted. Then, without warning, Corvin reached forward. "Sir, I'm going to need you to stand," he barked, extending his arm toward Darian's collar as if to physically move him. Darian's hand rose, not in retaliation, but as a barrier. Open palm, fingers splayed, a calm but unmistakable refusal to be touched. "Do not put your hands on me," Darian said, his voice low but firm, his gaze steady. The entire cabin seemed to inhale at once. Corvin froze for a second, hand hovering in the air, then slowly pulled it back. His jaw tightened, his nostrils flared. In seat 16A, a teenage boy leaned toward his father and whispered, "Something about this feels planned." The father gave a subtle nod. his own phone now recording just beneath the magazine in his lap. Corvin straightened his uniform with a jerk, as if trying to reclaim a sense of order that had already slipped from his grasp. He turned his head and shouted toward the front of the plane. "I need assistance at 2C. Nothing. No one came. The silence that followed was louder than the shout itself. Darian remained motionless, eyes now locked forward, his shoulders square, feet planted. He exhaled slowly, deliberately, an act of control, of calculation. Every part of him knew what this was becoming. A test. Not of documents, not of seating assignments, of restraint. Corvin stepped closer again, this time with fists curled slightly at his sides. "You will comply," he growled, louder this time, loud enough for everyone in the cabin to hear. But instead of fear, the sound triggered movement. Passengers lifted their phones higher. Screens glowed. Cameras pointed. Joran Vale leaned into the aisle, capturing both Corvin's flushed expression and Darian's unwavering calm. A ripple of tension spread row by row. Some passengers whispered. Others simply stared in disbelief. And yet, not one voice spoke in support of Corvin. His authority, once assumed, now hung suspended in midair, waiting for validation that never came. Corvin's breathing had quickened, his chest rising and falling with something that was no longer just anger but panic. He had stepped into a moment he didn't understand, one where power no longer responded to volume, but to proof. He reached again, toward Darian's chest this time, with a jerky, reckless motion. Cameras clicked. Darian didn't move, but 3 passengers did. One slid into the aisle. Another leaned across their seat. A third raised their voice, not in confrontation, but in warning. "Don't touch him," said the man in 2D, his tone neutral but heavy with consequence. Corvin hesitated. He looked around. The spell had broken. He was no longer the enforcer, just a man surrounded by people who saw everything. And still, Darian hadn't moved. He didn't need to. He had already won the moment without a word. His strategy had never been about confrontation, it was endurance. A quiet stand in the face of noise. The cabin held its breath as Corvin lowered his hand. His eyes darting between the lenses aimed his way and the man who refused to flinch. And in that space between breath and movement, Darian understood what was happening. This wasn't just a seat dispute. It wasn't even about rules. It was about testing the limits of injustice. How far it could be pushed before the world finally pushed back. Darian realized this was no longer about compliance. It was a test of how far injustice could be pushed before the world pushed back. Corvin Redder's hand locked around Darian Kessel's collar with sudden force, yanking upward with a violent jerk that startled the entire row. Gasps erupted like scattered sparks through the cabin as the movement jolted trays, rustled coats, and drew the instant attention of every passenger within eyesight. The sound of fabric tightening against Darian's chest was sharp, invasive, and unnatural, like a zipper being torn from a suit not meant to be opened that way. Darian's mind sharpened in an instant. He didn't cry out. He didn't flinch. His first instinct, reflexive, almost coded into his spine from years of composed leadership under pressure, was restraint. He planted his polished dress shoes flat against the floor, leaned his weight downward, and clamped both hands around the armrests. His grip was firm, immovable. Not a man resisting arrest, no, but a man anchoring himself in dignity. His body became ballast. His focus became precision. If Corvin was expecting a struggle, he received stillness so controlled that it robbed him of momentum. Corvin's face twisted in confusion, then anger, as the yank he'd expected to be theatrical and definitive backfired. His grip slipped. His forward pull met resistance, and that resistance sent his own balance tilting into chaos. He stumbled sideways, his right shoulder slamming awkwardly into the chest of a passenger seated across the aisle, a middle-aged man in a navy jacket who raised his arms in reflex. "What is wrong with you?" the man shouted, pushing Corvin away as others rose to their feet. Phones were already recording. They rose in a synchrony that felt rehearsed, but wasn't. Dozens of lenses blinked to life, each one framing the moment in real time, capturing the chaos from every angle. Corvin, once in control of the cabin, now flailed in front of it. Darian remained seated, breathing steadily through his nose. His collar was still wrinkled, the buttons on his shirt slightly askew, but his expression was calm. He knew this was the moment, this was where it turned. If he retaliated now, it would all be reframed. But if he stayed rooted, if he held the line, the world would see everything. Corvin, flushed and humiliated, turned back to Darian with fury in his eyes. "Don't resist me again," he growled, loud enough for the cabin to hear. His tone cracked, not with power, but with panic disguised as command. He lunged forward a second time, fingers clawed, aiming for Darian's collar again. But this time 3 men intercepted him. The first was the man in the navy jacket. The second was a younger passenger in a red hoodie who stepped into the aisle, arms outstretched. The third was an older gentleman with silver hair and the firm, deliberate posture of someone who had seen too many confrontations in his life. "That's enough," the older man said firmly, locking eyes with Corvin. "You will not touch him again." Corvin tried to shove past, but the 3 held their ground. Their presence created a line Corvin couldn't cross without escalating into violence, and everyone watching knew it. Whispers passed through the cabin like a breeze before a storm. Some passengers remained seated, recording. Others stood now, protective, forming a visible barrier around Darian's row. The atmosphere shifted. No longer silent observers, the passengers had become participants. Darian glanced at them, just briefly. A silent nod passed between him and the older gentleman, an unspoken thank you. Then he looked forward again, breathing slow and steady, knowing the cameras were still rolling. Let them see. Let them record. The truth didn't need volume, it only needed light. A distorted voice cracked through the intercom. "Flight crew, report status." The captain called from the cockpit, his tone half concerned, half confused. It was the voice of someone sensing disorder without understanding its scale. "I was attacked," Corvin shouted before anyone else could speak. "Passenger in 2A assaulted me." His lie rang out like a foul note in a quiet room. A beat of silence followed. Then, murmurs, disbelief, outrage, quiet laughter. One man near the back muttered, "Liar," just loud enough to be caught on several phones. Another passenger laughed under his breath and said, "Try explaining that to 12 cameras, pal." Darian didn't speak. He didn't need to. The contradiction was already unraveling. The recordings, the angles, the stillness of his hands on the armrests. All of it now stood in stark contrast to Corvin's fabricated cry for help. Corvin turned, stumbling free from the wall of passengers who had stopped him. His breathing was ragged now, his steps uneven as he bolted toward the front of the cabin, toward the curtain that shielded the cockpit. His jacket was disheveled. His walk had lost all confidence. He no longer moved like a man enforcing a rule. He moved like a man desperate to escape the consequences of his own unraveling. The aisle fell into a hush as passengers watched him go, eyes wide, phones still raised. In that moment, the cabin was no longer a confined commercial space. It was a courtroom, and every seat was a jury box. And in the center, Darian sat still. A single breath passed through his lips. Darian understood that the moment he chose calm over retaliation, the truth had already begun to win. Corvin didn't even wait for the captain's reply. He charged forward again, fists clenched, eyes locked on Darian like a man possessed. The cabin air tightened. Leather seats creaked beneath shifting passengers. The harsh buzz of overhead lighting trembled above the rising storm. Darian remained still, his spine upright, feet grounded, but his jaw locked in firm restraint. Around him, the atmosphere transformed, not with panic, but with resolve. Passengers stood, a wall of quiet defiance forming between Corvin and the man he was targeting. "Step aside," Corvin barked, his voice cracking under the weight of its own fury. "No," said one man, tall in a navy blazer, who stepped fully into the aisle. Another followed, younger, hands slightly trembling but eyes steady. Then a third. The wall thickened. Corvin faltered for half a second, stunned by the formation. He had expected submission, perhaps a fearful retreat or polite disagreement. But unity? This was something else. His brow furrowed with disbelief as he took another aggressive step forward. His breath sharp, uneven. The captain's voice crackled again through the intercom, demanding order in the cabin. But it was drowned out by the silent standoff building between one man's rage and a group's quiet resistance. "Move," Corvin growled again, but his voice lacked its former edge. Then came the voice, calm, stern, rich with something that stopped even Corvin mid-step. "That's enough." It didn't shout. It didn't threaten. It didn't plead. Yet it cut through the chaos like steel. Elon Marin stood slowly from seat 3D. An elderly man, neatly dressed in a charcoal vest and pressed shirt, with silver hair swept back and eyes that carried decades of unspoken knowledge. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't move into the aisle. He simply met Corvin's glare with a calm so absolute it stole the moment's rhythm. "You will step back now," Elon said. "This is no longer yours to control." Corvin's lip curled. "Sit down, old man. This doesn't concern you. It concerns every man in this cabin," Elon replied without blinking. "Especially when safety, process, and truth are being compromised." Darian's eyes shifted briefly to Elon, sensing that this stranger had just revealed a depth not easily measured. Something in the timbre of his voice, the control in his phrasing, carried the air of someone who'd once commanded rooms far more tense than this. Corvin scoffed and lunged forward again, but fate had its own choreography. His foot clipped the rim of a half-spilled beverage cup, a tiny, unnoticed detail left behind near seat 1B. It rolled an inch beneath his step, just enough to throw his balance. His weight shifted awkwardly. His torso tilted forward. Momentum betrayed him. Gasps rang out. Corvin's legs buckled. His arms flailed wildly in a desperate bid to catch himself. But the space was too tight, too narrow. He crashed against a seat back, ricocheted, and then slid, flat and ungraceful, down the center aisle. The sound was unmistakable. A thud, a scrape, the jostling bounce of a man's pride hitting the floor along with his body. Every phone in sight caught it. The descent from arrogance to humiliation was documented frame by frame as Corvin sprawled from the front of the cabin to midway down the aisle. Passengers stepped back instinctively, not out of fear, but to let the truth unfold uninterrupted. Corvin scrambled to his feet, his cheeks flushed with rage and embarrassment. His uniform wrinkled. His voice cracked as he spun toward the group behind him. "Stop filming!" he shouted, waving his arms wildly. "Stop now!" They didn't. Not a single hand lowered. Darian turned slowly to Eland, his voice low. "He thinks he can control the narrative." Eland didn't flinch. Not with this much truth around him. Corvin spun back toward Darian, his chest heaving, sweat dotting his temple. He pointed a trembling finger at the passengers. "You're all violating protocol." No one answered. No one moved. The silence was heavier than any shout. Darian stayed seated, his hands still calmly resting on his knees. His breathing was even, his face composed, but inside he was calculating. The footage, every second of it, had to reach the cockpit before Corvin could fabricate another lie. He needed to ensure the story remained unaltered, unedited, untwisted. Then Corvin made another critical error. He stormed toward the front of the plane, back toward the cockpit, eyes wild with panic. But this time, passengers followed. Not just one or two, a dozen, with cameras raised, steps deliberate. They weren't chasing him. They were escorting the truth. As Corvin passed the final row of first class, several of the men exchanged quiet glances, as if a silent agreement had been made. The truth would not be hidden. Not this time. The captain's voice crackled overhead again, demanding an update. No reply came from Corvin, because he was already storming toward the door, desperate to salvage what little control he thought he had left. But it was too late. Darian stood, slow and steady, picking up his tablet. He didn't rush. He didn't glare. He simply moved forward, like a man carrying proof, not vengeance. The corridor of passengers opened for him, a living testament to restraint. Darian knew that the fall down the aisle was not the end of the incident. It was only the beginning of accountability. Corvin Reddar stormed toward the cockpit, his footsteps sharp and erratic, fists clenched, shoulders tense. The cabin's air felt heavier with every step he took, thick with judgment from the very passengers he believed he had under control. His pride was fractured, his confidence cracked, but he still clung to one illusion, that if he could get to the captain first, he could shape the narrative, cast Darian as the aggressor, and emerge as the authority figure he so desperately needed to be. Darian Kessel remained seated, watching Corvin's retreating back with a quiet intensity. He adjusted his suit cuffs, tucked his tablet into the side of his seat, and turned briefly to check on the young man 2 rows back, the one Corvin had nearly shoved earlier in his rage. The teen gave him a small nod, a silent signal that he was fine. That moment grounded Darian. His objective had crystallized. Ensure the truth got to the cockpit before Corvin twisted it into something unrecognizable. Behind Corvin, a ripple of murmurs followed him like a shadow. Passengers began filming again, some zooming in as he approached the cockpit curtain. Dramatic irony pulsed like a quiet alarm. Corvin still thought he had the upper hand, still believed that the badge on his chest meant no one would question his version of events. But he didn't realize nearly every seat behind him held a witness, and nearly every witness held a phone capturing every breath he took. Eland Marin stood quietly from his seat, smooth in motion despite his age. His silver hair gleamed under the cabin light, and his voice, though soft, carried the resonance of authority forged through decades. "May I?" he asked, turning toward Darian with calm respect. Darian looked up, studied the man for a second, and gave a measured nod. He sensed something deeper in the man's tone, an unspoken rank that didn't require uniforms. Eland stepped forward, his stride deliberate, as Darian kept his eyes on the curtain at the front. Meanwhile, Corvin burst through it without waiting for protocol, ignoring every rule of aviation chain of command. The cockpit door stood ajar, and Captain Lauren Dakes turned sharply in his seat as Corvin entered unannounced. "What are you doing?" the captain snapped, surprised. Corvin didn't blink. "It's the passenger in 1A," he became hostile, refused multiple commands. "I believe he may need to be restrained upon landing." But before the captain could reply, the curtain behind Corvin swayed, then froze in place. A collective presence had formed. Passengers had gathered in silence, their phones already lifted, their expressions resolute. It wasn't a mob, it was something more powerful. A wall of witnesses. Darian rose from his seat, not in defiance, not in fury, in resolve. He stepped down the aisle with grace, his eyes forward, not even glancing at the phones surrounding him. His walk was slow, deliberate, as if every footstep had its own purpose. The cabin quieted, watching the man who had remained calm through it all now approach the heart of the aircraft. Then, a soft chime echoed through the ceiling, a mechanical, neutral tone, but one that drew every head upward. The cabin's automatic safety recorder had activated. Captain Dakes turned toward his console in surprise. The activation had been triggered by an irregular event, an unauthorized crew member entering the cockpit in flight. "What just happened?" Dakes asked, shifting his attention between Corvin and the system panel. Corvin stiffened. "Nothing. It's standard protocol." But the captain wasn't listening anymore. His gaze drifted past Corvin and landed on the growing group outside the curtain. "Captain," one man called, lifting his phone. "We have something you need to see." Another joined him, then a third. Eland Marin stepped into the front row, arms crossed, not saying a word. His presence said enough. Darian stopped a few feet behind Corvin and stood silently. Corvin turned, suddenly realizing what was happening. He wasn't in control. Not anymore. Captain Dakes moved from his seat and took one of the offered phones. The screen glowed with footage, clear, high-resolution, time-stamped video of Corvin grabbing Darian's collar, yelling, trying to drag him, stumbling down the aisle, shouting again. The captain's jaw tensed as he watched. "This is just one angle," another passenger said. There are at least 10 more. Corvin stepped back. These are edited. They're not, came a voice from the back. Mine started before you even touched him. You lied. Corvin faltered. The captain looked up slowly, his eyes now locked on the man who had barged into his cockpit without permission, lied to his face, and violated multiple regulations before the plane had even landed. Darian said nothing. He didn't need to. The curtain now hung wide open, and in that space, truth filled the void. Not through shouting, not through force, through quiet, collective clarity. Darian felt the shift. The truth was no longer hidden in phones. It was standing boldly in front of the cockpit door. Captain Lauren's voice sliced through the tension. Mr. Reddar, step outside the cockpit while I review the footage. His tone was firm, practiced, and final. But Corvin didn't budge. They're edited. Corvin barked, pointing frantically at the cluster of passengers still gathered behind him. His voice cracked, wobbling on the edge of desperation. None of that's real. People can stitch anything these days. Darian Kessel remained silent, standing just a few feet away from the confrontation. He didn't flinch, didn't speak. His posture was calm but unmistakably firm, feet slightly apart, shoulders squared, gaze unwavering. He was no longer just a passenger. He was now a witness whose restraint was beginning to outweigh the chaos around him. Corvin turned to him, eyes wild. You're in on this, he hissed. You all are. But before he could spiral further, a tall businessman stepped forward, Joran Vale, the man who had quietly been recording from 2 rows back since the conflict began. He raised his tablet high and with a calm voice said, Captain, I have 3 separate angles, all raw footage. No edits. Time-stamped. Want to see. Corvin's face drained of color. The pale hue that overtook his cheeks betrayed more than embarrassment. It suggested fear. He took a step backward, hand twitching, eyes darting between the camera lenses pointed at him and the unwavering composure of Darian. The atmosphere in the cabin seemed to crystallize in that moment. The passengers no longer just observed. They became a wall of truth, unshakable and united. One after another, men around the cabin began confirming what the footage already showed. A retired teacher, a regional tech rep, even the teenager seated near the emergency exit. Each calmly recounted the incident, how Corvin had targeted Darian from the beginning, how he insisted on needless checks, how he reached for Darian's collar. Their testimonies rang with synchronicity, each reinforcing the other like woven threads of a story too solid to untangle. Then a voice rose from the rear of the cabin. I heard him on the phone before we boarded, the young man said, standing awkwardly near the lavatory. He said something like, we'll make an example out of someone in first class. I thought he was joking, but the words hung in the air like smoke. Darian's brow furrowed slightly, filing the statement away. The foreshadowing was undeniable now. This wasn't a random outburst, it might have been premeditated. Corvin's breathing grew ragged. He lunged forward. Suddenly, eyes locked on Joran's tablet. Give me that, he barked, hand extended in a reckless grab. But the passengers moved in perfect unison, backward. It was almost theatrical. Joran stepped back calmly, and the others, without panic or violence, simply made space. Corvin's hand swiped through empty air, his balance thrown by the momentum of his own desperation. He stumbled once, regained footing, but barely. Darian raised his hand, not to stop Corvin, but to signal the others. Stay calm, he said quietly, his voice measured, a calm thread through the escalating scene. The passengers heeded it instantly. There was no need for chaos. Truth was already louder than noise. Corvin spun around, trying to recover what little control he had left, but he misjudged his distance. His heel caught the edge of the service cart behind him. For a split second, the entire cabin froze. Then the crash. He toppled backward into the metal cart's tray compartment with a deafening clang. The sound echoed through the aircraft like a dropped anchor in a still sea. Corvin's limbs tangled awkwardly, one arm wedged between a row of plastic cups and a bin of utensils. Gasps erupted. some in shock, a few stifled chuckles in disbelief, but no one moved to help. Not out of cruelty, but because the reality had become undeniable. Corvin was no longer a figure of authority. He was now a cautionary example. Captain Loren stepped forward, no longer uncertain. "Corvin Reddar," he said, eyes sharp. "You're hereby suspended from all crew duties for the remainder of this flight." Corvin tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing without forming words, as he awkwardly pushed himself upright. Captain, please, he stammered, but the words had lost weight. Two large men emerged from mid-cabin, off-duty security contractors, their uniforms casual but their presence commanding. One of them nodded silently to the captain. The other gestured firmly toward Corvin. "Sir, let's go." Corvin looked around one last time, as if still hoping someone might defend him. But all he saw were cameras, folded arms, and the silent truth in every face. No rescue would come. He allowed himself to be escorted away. Darien exhaled slowly, then turned and returned to his seat. The atmosphere, once crackling with tension, seemed to shift, not to ease, but to recalibrate. Power had returned to its rightful place. And for the first time since the incident began, no one was looking at Darien with uncertainty. Only respect. Darien understood that sometimes the strongest blow is delivered by the weight of undeniable truth, not fists. Corvin Reddar sat slumped near the galley, his uniform wrinkled. His wrists loosely restrained with a fabric harness meant more for symbolic containment than physical force. The metallic clink of the service cart he had toppled minutes earlier still echoed faintly in the tense cabin, as if the air refused to forget the chaos. He blinked, stunned and shallow breathing, unaware of how many eyes had turned against him, and how completely he'd lost control of the narrative. Captain Loren Dakes, still visibly disturbed by the incident, turned to Darien Kessel and gestured toward the vacant jump seat at the front. "Mr. Kessel," he said, voice measured, "I'd like your account, in detail." Darien rose without hesitation. His movements were calm, deliberate. He stepped past passengers still holding their phones. Their screens paused on frames that captured Corvin's aggression in crisp, unforgiving angles. Every step he took was heavy with both the burden of truth and the clarity of restraint. He took his seat across from the captain, inhaled once, and began. "I boarded with the clear intent to remain composed." Darien started, his tone neither defensive nor emotional, just resolute. "He began singling me out the moment I sat down. First the glances, then the repeated checks, the shoulder bump, then the collar grab." As he spoke, Corvin squirmed near the galley, straining to hear every word. But it was clear the tide had turned. Every passenger nearby leaned in closer, not out of curiosity, but out of quiet solidarity. They had all seen what Darien described. Many had recorded it. Dramatic irony thickened like storm clouds gathering over a calm sea. Corvin, once so confident in his authority, had no idea how uniformly his version was being dismantled. Joran Vale, the businessman who had filmed the incident from 2 seats back, had already uploaded his footage to the flight's internal cloud server, a direct link to the airline's independent review board. Several other passengers followed suit, each angle another nail in the coffin of Corvin's deception. A sudden voice interrupted the moment. "I'd like to add something to that," said Elon Marin, rising slowly from his seat in row 3A. The cabin hushed. Elon's presence, dignified and deliberate, carried the weight of a man used to being listened to. Captain Loren turned to him. "And you are?" Elon stepped forward with quiet authority. "Elon Marin, retired Senior Inspector, Aviation Standards Bureau. I've conducted over 400 flight conduct reviews and cabin integrity assessments. I recognized procedural violations the moment Corvin insisted on document re-verification without cause." Gasps rippled through the cabin. Even Darien turned slightly, his brow lifting with quiet recognition. Corvin, upon hearing the name, stiffened. The color drained from his face as if gravity had stolen his confidence. Eland continued, "From my seat, I began drafting a preliminary misconduct report. I'd like to submit it formally upon landing. Captain Lauren nodded. That will be invaluable. I'd also suggest flagging this flight for what's called a crew integrity crisis under Article 7G of Cabin Ethics Protocol, Eland added calmly. The captain blinked. That's reserved for serious internal breaches. Eland didn't flinch. This qualifies. A slow, dawning silence filled the space. Corvin, still seated near the galley floor, let out a weak protest. Please, I just need to speak to someone. I can explain. His voice cracked at the edges, no longer commanding, now pleading. Captain Lauren narrowed his eyes. There'll be no private conversations. Not after what I've seen. Corvin looked around the cabin, desperate, searching for any ally. But the faces he found were unreadable. Hardened. Not cruel but resolute. Darian watched him in silence, his arms folded, his eyes steady. There was no satisfaction in watching Corvin unravel, only a deep, silent confirmation that the truth was louder than any accusation. The tension shifted slightly as Joran Vale approached and spoke directly to the captain. My footage and others are synced to the incident cloud. You should have access through your internal panel. Captain Lauren nodded, already turning toward the control console near his seat. Received. Reviewing now. Just then, the aircraft shook, a brief drop in altitude, a pocket of turbulence that sent a ripple of gasps through the cabin. Corvin, seated awkwardly near the metal galley wall, slid forward a few inches, bumping against a drawer with a muted thump. The jolt broke the intensity just enough to trigger nervous laughter from a few passengers. Darian remained upright, one hand braced on the nearby seat. Please, he said calmly to the cabin. Let's all stay seated. The captain glanced back at him, grateful. We'll stabilize soon. The aircraft leveled out, the seatbelt signs still illuminated in a steady orange glow. But no one was moving now. The storm outside the windows paled in comparison to the reckoning within the cabin. Darian turned to Eland and offered a quiet nod of gratitude. Eland returned it with equal calm, then moved back to his seat to continue his documentation. Captain Lauren leaned closer to Darian, lowering his voice. Upon landing, you won't disembark right away. Investigators will board first. I've already notified Ehrenfield Compliance Authority. They'll want to hear from you directly. Darian nodded. Understood. He glanced back toward Corvin one final time. The flight attendant was no longer glaring, he was shrinking. Each second drew him further from the false authority he once clung to. The storm he tried to orchestrate had inverted on him, swallowing him whole. Darian sat back down and fastened his seatbelt once more. The cabin returned to quiet, but the silence was filled with waiting. Not fear, but something heavier. The weight of truth preparing to land. Darian sensed that the real storm was not in the sky. It was waiting on the runway. The cabin lights dimmed as the descent tone chimed overhead, casting a bluish haze over the first-class section. Outside, the sky turned a heavy gradient of amber and steel, clouds beginning to ripple as the aircraft pierced the lower altitudes. Inside, the mood had shifted, no longer chaos, but something taut and quiet. A breath held across 40 rows. Darian Kessel sat upright in his seat, seatbelt snug, briefcase secured beside him. His fingers were motionless on his lap, but his mind moved like circuitry in high voltage. Every detail from the past hour, every word, every action, every slur from Corvin Reddar, was stored precisely in sequence. His objective was now unshakable. Protect the chain of evidence until the Ehrenfield officers boarded. No misstep, no breach, no chance for the truth to be distorted. 2 rows back, Corvin sat visibly sweating, lips twitching, eyes darting toward every passenger who dared glance his way. His authority was gone, stripped not by rebellion, but by exposure. And yet, he clung to fragments of denial, leaning subtly toward a tall passenger in 3C and whispering, "You saw it, right?" He was aggressive. "You saw that." The man turned slowly, his expression unimpressed. "I saw you grab him by the collar and try to drag him down the aisle." That's what I saw. Corvin's face tightened. He looked to his left, whispered again, this time to a younger man across the aisle. Look, there's context. They'll twist it. Just say you felt unsafe. Don't. The young man replied flatly, folding his arms. There are 40 recordings. Don't insult us. Darian observed it all from his peripheral vision, his focus unblinking. He didn't need to speak. The truth had become autonomous now, multiplying, syncing, living across phones, cloud uploads, and flight logs. He had already won the first battle, preserving dignity in the face of provocation. Now came the harder part, ensuring no one erased it before justice arrived. Eland Marin leaned slightly over from the opposite row. His voice, as steady as ever, reached Darian in a hush only the nearest few could hear. When we land, you'll see uniforms, dark navy, Arenfield insignia over the left chest. They'll be fast, clinical. They'll want raw accounts and any footage not already synced. Darian nodded once, eyes still ahead. Eland's face was calm but serious. If they follow standard compliance response protocol, they'll isolate Corvin first. Then verify chain of command. Then, they'll want your statement. Be ready. They'll test you too. I'm ready, Darian said, his voice quiet, even. Eland hesitated, then added, I investigated a similar case once. Not as public as this. Different airline. Different outcome. That attendant, he had been protected. Someone higher up covered the logs, buried complaints. The rot was deeper than expected. That made Darian turn his head. You think that could be the case here? Eland's eyes didn't blink. I saw the way he made that call before takeoff. The way he spoke, like someone waiting for permission. A flicker of tension passed through Darian's shoulders, but he controlled it. If true, that meant this wasn't just a rogue employee, it might be a systemic issue. The stakes were higher than personal justice now. It was a structural reckoning. Behind them, several passengers whispered, hushed tones of admiration and disbelief. I've never seen someone stay that calm. He didn't raise a hand. Not once. Hope they fire the whole chain of command. The hum of the descent deepened. Tray tables locked. Cabin crew, those who had remained neutral, moved silently down the aisles, performing last checks. Corvin remained untouched, his own colleagues offering no defense. A tremor passed through the aircraft, a minor shudder from altitude adjustment, but Corvin jumped, flinching as if expecting another fall. The silence of judgment around him was heavier than any turbulence. Captain Lauren's voice emerged over the intercom, crisp and professional. Ladies and gentlemen, as we begin our descent, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Upon arrival, this aircraft will be met by Arenfield compliance officers for a procedural matter. Your cooperation is appreciated. The words hit like a soft siren. Passengers straightened. Corvin shrank. No, they can't, Corvin muttered to himself. He pressed the call button. No one responded. He looked toward the front. Captain, he called out, desperation now clinging to his tone. Captain Lauren, I just want to talk. I just need to clarify. Please. No response. He turned to Darian, wild-eyed. You don't have to do this. This will destroy my career. Darian didn't move. I didn't start this. Corvin leaned forward, almost pleading. We could say it was a misunderstanding, that it got out of hand. They'll believe it if we both say it. They'll believe the footage, Darian said coldly. At that, Corvin collapsed back into his seat. His chest heaved. He knew. The footage was indisputable. The plane continued its slow descent, the city lights of Valeport flickering below. Darian quietly gathered his items. Tablet, briefcase, phone. He turned slightly in his seat to glance at the teenager who had stood up during the altercation. The boy nodded at him, nervous, but proud. Darian gave a subtle nod back, gratitude tucked inside restraint. Seatbelt lights glowed. The wing flaps extended. In that stillness before landing, Eland whispered one final thing. The real fight begins on the ground. Most truths are buried there. The wheels emerged with a whine. The runway lights aligned. Darian leaned back, his mind now sharper than ever. The plane began its final approach, engines humming low and steady. And then contact. The wheels touched asphalt with a jolt that seemed to seal everything. Darian understood that the descent was not taking him toward an airport. It was taking him toward truth, consequences, and unexpected revelations. He tugged harder, convinced the CEO would submit, unaware that every passenger's camera was rolling, and the aisle would become his stage of humiliation. If you believe abuse always crumbles under witness and truth, hit subscribe now, because justice never waits. The moment the wheels struck the runway with a jarring thud, the cabin lurched forward in unified silence. Seatbelts tugged against waists. Hands gripped armrests, but no one said a word. The air was thick with anticipation, not just for the end of the flight, but for the reckoning that awaited. Darian Kessel's gaze remained steady, fixed forward. He knew exactly what mattered now, protecting the chain of evidence. The videos, the statements, the timeline, they had to remain untampered, untouched. His fingers hovered near the slim black case where his tablet was stored, already backed up twice to 2 secure cloud nodes. There would be no rewriting of history. Not this time. Across the aisle, Corvin Reddar sat hunched, his posture stiff and knuckles white against the seat edge, like a man awaiting judgment but still hoping for a loophole. He glanced around, eyes darting from one disapproving passenger to the next, breathing shallow. His expression flickered between defiance and fear, lips twitching as if preparing a final excuse. He still believed he might be escorted off quietly, salvaging some shred of dignity. He didn't know the officers outside had already seen the footage. Everyone remained seated until further instruction. Came the captain's voice, stern, controlled, but heavy with implication. Then a soft electronic chime echoed through the cabin as the aircraft doors released with a faint hiss. The tension in the cabin didn't ease. It shifted, hardened. Every passenger knew that the truth was about to enter the aisle in uniform. 3 men stepped aboard, tall, composed, their navy jackets pressed clean with a silver insignia stitched at the shoulder. AFC 4. Aaron Field, Compliance Division, Section 4. Their presence was calm but decisive. Leading them was Inspector Raxon Durrell, his deep-set eyes scanning the cabin like a silent radar. He raised a hand, not for silence, but for respect. "Good afternoon. I'm Inspector Durrell. We'll need full cooperation," he said, his voice low and deliberate, carrying an unmistakable weight of authority. No one objected. Heads nodded. Phones were clutched tighter. Darian gave the smallest nod of acknowledgement. No panic, no pride, just calm preparedness. Durrell moved down the aisle, his steps measured, eyes fixed directly on Darian. "Mr. Kessel?" "Yes," Darian said, rising slowly. His voice was steady, clipped with professionalism but layered with awareness. "I've secured the primary footage, 3 synchronized angles. I can submit them securely." "We've seen the first transmissions," Durrell said, lowering his voice slightly. "There's more than enough for escalation. But there's something you should know." Darian tilted his head. "I'm listening." Durrell tapped the small tablet in his hand and revealed a note, a log entry dated before takeoff. Corvin Reddar entered an internal note marking you as agitated and non-compliant. Before a word was exchanged. Before boarding even finished. Darian's eyes narrowed. "So it was premeditated." "Appears that way," Durrell confirmed. Around them, passengers murmured, soft, shocked voices blending with the low hum of the idle engines. At that moment, Eland Marin stood up from the second row and approached slowly, holding a folded paper in one hand. "Inspector," he said with measured composure. Corvin Reddar violated procedure before pushback. "I observed him accessing crew files not authorized for cabin staff." His voice had the sharp precision of someone who'd spent a lifetime enforcing order. Durrell accepted the paper without a word, scanning it quickly. Then, from behind the third row, a sudden outburst shattered the rhythm. "They told me to enforce standards," Corvin shouted, his voice cracking as he stood, trembling. I was told. Superiors are watching. This was part of protocol. All eyes turned. The cabin froze. Who told you that? Durrell asked quietly, stepping toward him. Corvin gripped the back of a seat like a man holding on to the last edge of a cliff. I did what I was told, he said again. But this time there was no fire, just unraveling panic. Darian's stomach sank, not from fear, but from confirmation. This wasn't random. This wasn't a rogue crew member lashing out. This had roots, depth. The phrase superiors watching echoed in his mind like a key fitting into a locked door he didn't know was there. Something systemic had bled into that cabin. And now it was exposed. Reddar, you're to stand for transfer, Durrell said firmly. No, Corvin whispered, shaking his head. No, you don't understand what happens if I... Two officers stepped forward. Corvin backed against the seat, clutching it until his knuckles went pale. But it was no use. They reached under his arms and lifted him clean from the spot. Let go of me, he screamed, thrashing, kicking toward the aisle. I was just doing what they said. You don't get it? There are layers to this. But the passengers had heard enough. Abused your power, one shouted. Dragged him for nothing, said another. You're a disgrace, added a voice near the rear cabin. The plane roared, not with engines, but with voices, unified not in volume, but in moral precision. Darian stepped calmly beside Inspector Durrell, who nodded toward him. Your statement will be vital. You saw the entire sequence unfold. I'll cooperate fully, Darian said, his voice even but pointed. But I think this goes higher than just one crew member. Durrell's eyes flicked toward Corvin, who now hung between two officers, shoulders hunched and face pale with something deeper than shame, fear. Darian met the inspector's gaze once more and said, He's afraid of someone who isn't on this flight. Durrell's lips pressed into a firm line. Then we're not done investigating. And as Corvin was dragged past the remaining passengers, shouting broken fragments of unfinished warnings, Darian remained composed, his hands folded in front of him, ready for what came next. Darian realized the moment Corvin mentioned orders. The Rayall investigation had only just begun. Corvin twisted violently from the grasp of the two Ehrenfield compliance officers just as they neared the jet bridge door. With a sudden grunt, he jerked his shoulder free and broke into a desperate sprint. Gasps erupted behind him, passengers leaning into the aisle, some rising instinctively, others frozen in place. His shoes pounded against the thin carpet as he raced toward the sealed terminal door, arms pumping, breath ragged. His eyes, wild, frantic, locked onto the faint metallic reflection of the emergency release lever just beyond the glass. He never made it. The jet bridge door was locked tight, its security light glowing red. Corvin slammed into it with the full momentum of his body, a sickening thud echoing through the enclosed space. His shoulder crumpled against the steel, sending him sprawling backward onto the floor in a tangled heap of limbs and breathless humiliation. The two officers, moving with calm efficiency, closed in again. This time they didn't offer him words. One pinned his legs while the other secured his wrists with reinforced transport restraints. Corvin thrashed for a moment longer, eyes darting between the passengers now crowding near the front of the cabin, their phones raised high, filming everything in high definition. Some whispered, others simply stared in silence, the weight of the moment settling over them like cabin pressure. Darian Kessel didn't move. He remained standing a few feet behind the last row of first class, his expression unreadable but his eyes focused sharp. He had tracked every second of the outburst, storing it not with malice, but with meticulous observation. His objective had crystallized. No longer was this about avoiding conflict or protecting personal dignity. It was about uncovering the why behind Corvin's breakdown. Who had given him the impression that this kind of behavior was sanctioned? Inspector Raxon Durrell returned to the cabin with a clipped tone and a visible shift in demeanor. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, standing just beside the first-class curtain. Before disembarkation, we'll need each of you to provide a brief account of what you witnessed. This is essential to ensure all facts are preserved. The passengers murmured their agreement, many already reviewing their videos, trimming timestamps, preparing to contribute. Darian gave a slow nod, silently acknowledging the subtle brilliance of Raxon's method. Secure the truth before it had a chance to slip away. At the edge of the curtain, Eland Marin leaned closer to the inspector and whispered something that drew Raxon's brows together. "Are you sure?" Raxon asked, his voice barely audible. "I don't forget faces," Eland replied calmly. He was part of a gate misconduct audit at Vorlich's Gate Center. For years ago, the report was sealed, but the pattern's the same: aggression, manipulation of reports, passenger targeting. I had my doubts then. Now I don't. Raxon glanced over his shoulder toward the restrained Corvin, whose chest heaved with shallow, erratic breaths. "If what you're saying holds," he murmured, "we might be looking at a pattern, not an outlier." "I'd bet my license on it," Eland said, then stepped back, folding his arms across his chest like a man who had just dropped a match into dry kindling. As Raxon turned to move deeper into the cabin, Darian stepped to intercept him. "What did he mean?" he asked, voice low, steady. "Vorlich's cover-ups." Raxon's eyes searched his for a moment, as if weighing what could safely be shared. "There's a possibility that Corvin wasn't just unstable. He may have been moved between terminals. Not fired. Not investigated. Just shifted. Like a liability nobody wanted to deal with." Darian exhaled slowly. The tension in his shoulders didn't ease. It concentrated. "So this wasn't just Corvin's choice," he said. "It was enabled." "That's what we're starting to suspect," Raxon confirmed. "And if it's true, we'll find out who signed the transfers, who wrote the evaluations, who watched the footage and buried it." A few rows behind them, a teenage passenger raised his hand and offered to provide early footage he had uploaded to the cloud. Another middle-aged man leaned across the aisle and said he'd heard Corvin muttering before takeoff, something about enforcing something in first class. Piece by piece, the room of witnesses built a wall around the truth, one brick of testimony at a time. Inside his mind, Darian assembled a quiet timeline. The cold stare before boarding, the targeted seat checks, the sudden grab at his collar, the attempt to force a spectacle, and now, this. A failed escape, a name from the past, and a thread of implication that someone higher up had been pulling strings from a distance. Corvin, still struggling, shouted into the cabin. "You don't understand. I followed protocol. I was told there were rules, the real rules." His voice cracked mid-sentence, turning the final word into a rasp of desperation. No one responded. The weight of his failure had collapsed his composure into a heap of incoherence. Raxon signaled to his team, "Get him out of visual range. Process the passengers one at a time. Kessel last. I need his full statement." Two officers nodded and wheeled Corvin away, his protests trailing off into broken syllables as the hallway absorbed his voice. The curtain fell behind them, soft but final. Darian remained still, watching the path Corvin had taken out of sight. There was no joy in the scene, no vindication. Only confirmation this had never been about one man. It was a system with corners too dark and too silent for too long. Raxon's voice brought him back. "Mr. Kessel, when you're ready, we'll talk privately. But I'll say this now, your insight may shape more than this investigation." Darian gave a faint nod. "I'll be ready." As the door to the makeshift interview room opened, and the first passengers were gently guided to recount what they saw, Darian closed his eyes for one brief moment. He didn't need to replay the chaos, he had lived every beat. But he knew this wasn't the end. Not yet. Darian sensed that Corvin's collapse at the door was not just panic. It was fear of something much bigger behind him. The door clicked shut behind him. Darian Kessel stood still for a moment, the quiet inside the interview room pressing in like a seal. The air was colder here, more clinical. Across the steel-framed table sat Inspector Raxon Durrell, flanked by two other men. Karen Vale, lean and quiet with a tablet already glowing in front of him, and Jessen Marrick, older, broad-shouldered, eyes sharp behind narrow glasses. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, casting sterile light over everything. "No windows," Just gray walls and truth waiting to be spoken. Mr. Kessel, Raxon said calmly, gesturing to the seat across from him. This is a standard compliance review. You're not under any investigation, but your account will be the centerpiece of ours. Darian nodded once, setting his briefcase gently beside his chair before sitting down. His posture was straight, dignified, measured, but inside, his mind raced, not with panic, but with structure. He had built systems for a living. Now he would dismantle one. I'm ready to begin, he said. Karen tapped the recorder. A red light blinked to life. Please describe the events that took place beginning from your boarding of Flight 318, Raxon instructed. Darian began speaking, not rushed, not emotional, just facts. But each one came with weight. The prolonged stare from Corvin Reddar, the unnecessary seat inspections, the first muttered insult, the moment Corvin grabbed his collar and tried to pull him up like baggage. As Darian recounted the scene, Jessen leaned forward slightly, exchanging a brief glance with Karen. Raxon noticed too. Something about their expressions shifted. Not surprise, but confirmation. Like a line had connected 2 points they'd suspected but hadn't voiced. Darian noticed. He didn't comment on it. Eland Marin entered quietly 5 minutes later, a notepad in hand. He didn't sit, but stood at Darian's shoulder like a pillar. Before we go further, he said in his gravel-thick voice, I can verify multiple procedural breaches before the aircraft left the gate. Corvin Reddar accessed the restricted crew module in the check-in system 20 minutes before boarding. That's not within the scope of his position. Karen raised his brows. You're sure? I watched it with my own eyes, Eland said flatly. He cross-referenced crew advisories. That's internal data meant for supervisory review only. Raxon nodded. Thank you. That confirms one of our alerts. Then Jessen interjected. We also pulled Corvin Reddar's device logs before the plane reached cruising altitude, he said, scrolling on his own tablet. There's something here that changes the scope of this entirely. He rotated the screen toward Darian. A timestamp blinked across the top, 6 minutes before takeoff. An encrypted message sat on the display, decrypted now in cold, unmistakable text. Selected passenger confirmed. In Force Stage 2, the silence that followed was not empty. It was dense, alive. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Darian's eyes locked on the words. His voice was low when he asked, Is this real? Jessen nodded. Verified through the aircraft's internal messaging relay. Do you have any idea who sent it? That part is still under review, Raxon answered carefully. But we suspect the order came from an internal terminal, possibly within the Velora air scheduling system. Darian leaned forward, elbows on the table now. That phrase, in Force Stage 2, implies multiple stages. Protocol. This wasn't improvisation. He was following a playbook. Foreshadowing struck like a bell. The teenage passenger's voice came back in Darian's memory. He said something about making an example. At the time, it had sounded like ego. Now, it sounded like programming. Jessen sat back. If what you're suggesting is true, Mr. Kessel, then this isn't about a rogue employee. It's about something bigger. A framework, Darian said. An operational one. Possibly algorithm-based. Possibly human-tagged. But I've seen this before, just not in aviation. He looked up at Raxon, who now regarded him not just as a witness, but as an asset. This isn't my first encounter with targeted behavior mapping, Darian continued. My company designs safety protocols for high-security transport environments. If Velora Air is using anything like a selective engagement algorithm on passengers without disclosure, they're in violation, Raxon finished, of every federal equivalent statute governing fair transit. Karen tapped notes. Jessen stood and began pacing slowly, thinking aloud. We need to see who authorized that message, and what Stage 1 might have been. Eland Marin folded his arms. Stage 1 was the flagging. Stage 2 was the confrontation. If there's a Stage 3, someone upstairs knows what it is. Raxon exhaled through his nose. Then he turned to Darian. How soon can you provide us with a reconstruction model of how such a protocol might function if someone were misusing it to flag passengers? I can deliver a draft in 24 hours, Darian said, but I'll need access to interface logs, tagging criteria, and supervisor communication. You'll have it, Raxon promised. Outside the glass wall, passengers milled in the terminal beyond. Some glanced in, quiet, respectful, watching. One older man gave Darian a nod, a hand over his heart. Then movement drew his eye. Corvin Reddar passed by in a wheelchair, his arms bound, his eyes darting like trapped electricity. His mouth moved, but no sound came through the reinforced glass. What mattered was no longer what Corvin had to say, but what he had already revealed. Fear had replaced anger in his expression. And fear, Darian understood, was rarely born from regret. It was born from exposure. He turned back to the table. I've said all I need to say, he told the inspectors calmly. But I'm available for anything further. I don't want this swept into a footnote. Raxon nodded in full agreement. It won't be. The recorder blinked off. Outside, the hallway lights flickered gently, as if even the airport was holding its breath. Darian understood he had not just survived an attack. He had uncovered the first piece of a much larger truth. The door to the private lounge clicked shut behind him, muffling the distant hum of airport announcements and the low murmur of passengers still processing what had just occurred. Darian Kessel stepped inside, his gait steady, his pulse calm on the outside, but inside, every mental gear had begun to spin with precision. The leather sofa invited rest, and the steward who escorted him gestured toward a chilled water bottle on the table. Assuming this room was for recovery. It wasn't. Not for Darian. He didn't sit. Instead, he walked to the far side of the room where the tinted window overlooked the tarmac. Somewhere below, Corvin Reddar had been moved into a secure holding space, restrained and isolated. But Darian knew the man's outburst was only one part of a much deeper pattern. His mind flashed back to the encrypted message investigators had found on Corvin's device just before takeoff. Selected passenger confirmed. Enforce Stage 2. He repeated it under his breath like a puzzle. Enforce Stage 2. He tapped his fingers against the window's frame, thinking. That phrase didn't belong to any known crew protocol. It sounded covert, deliberate, and too rehearsed to be spontaneous. Just then, a knock on the door broke his concentration. Inspector Raxon Durrell entered, his navy jacket still zipped, a folder tucked under his arm. His expression was equal parts impressed and unsettled. You didn't rest, Raxon said flatly, noticing Darian still standing. There's no time for that, Darian replied, finally turning. You found something. Raxon nodded. More than we expected. He opened the folder and laid out 3 pages across the lounge table. Corvin wasn't acting alone. We found references in the archived crew database, something called SPP, Selective Passenger Protocol. Darian's eyebrows lifted. I thought that was shut down years ago. It was, Raxon confirmed, at least officially, but someone reactivated it inside Velora Air's internal clearance system. Quietly, no audit trail, no flags, just a silent toggle, switched on inside a supervisor access shell. Darian approached the documents, eyes scanning fast. Diagrams, lists, coded terms. His voice grew sharp. So the behavior algorithm, was it running? According to the logs, Raxon said, leaning forward. Yes, and it flagged you, based on parameters we're still deciphering. But it was outdated, never approved for deployment. A pause hung heavy between them. Darian exhaled, his voice calm but cold. So they never shut it down. They just buried it. The door opened again. This time, Officer Karen Vale entered, followed by a mid-level supervisor, Haldren Voss. He looked younger than expected, mid-30s, sleeves rolled to the elbow, but his eyes gave him away, cornered, nervous, flicking between faces like someone searching for the least dangerous answer. He's ready to talk, Karen said. Haldren cleared his throat. I didn't create the protocol, all right? I just authorized observational use for certain profiles flagged by the system. I didn't think it would escalate. Darian's voice cut through the air. You told Corvin to observe me. Haldren nodded slowly. Yes, but he wasn't supposed to engage. Then why? Raxon asked, stepping closer. Was there an encrypted directive that included a Stage 2 enforcement? Haldren's hands twitched at his sides. Because someone above me instructed it. I didn't send that message. Then who did? Darian pressed. I don't know. Haldren snapped, voice cracking. It came from a masked internal account. We don't have visibility. Only base-level override clearance. It could have been anyone in upper ops. Darian stepped back, folding his arms. Behind him, the sound of footsteps and muffled conversation filtered in from the hallway. Several passengers from the flight had been moved into the adjacent lounge, waiting to be briefed. Through the wall, Darian could hear them whispering, some reliving the ordeal, others trying to understand how such a system ever existed. Raxon paced slowly. This just escalated from one rogue attendant to a potential cover-up involving supervisory ranks. We'll need a full audit of the airline's decision hierarchy. I can help with that, Darian said calmly. Raxon looked at him. I run a firm that builds transparency protocols for ethical tech deployment, Darian explained. We audit automated systems, bias patterns, internal override failures. If this behavior flagging system was ever connected to passenger assignment logs, it can be traced, even if masked. You'd be willing to consult? Karen asked. Darian nodded. If it ensures this never happens again. For the first time, Raxon's shoulders relaxed. He motioned toward the lounge door. The review team will begin extracting server data in the next hour. Velora Air's legal unit has been notified. They're already trying to downplay this. Darian picked up the printed message from the folder again. Selected passenger confirmed. He whispered, How many others were selected before me? No one answered. From the hallway, a voice called Raxon's name. Another lead had been discovered. As the inspector stepped out, Darian moved toward the window once more. The sun had begun to dip behind the skyline, casting long shadows across the tarmac where the jet still sat idle, quarantined. A gate agent stood motionless near the aircraft stairs, waiting for clearance to board. The polished exterior of the plane shimmered in the light, but Darian no longer saw shine. He saw the seams. He saw what had been hidden beneath them, and he knew it wasn't over yet. Darian realized the incident on the plane had cracked open a door that could finally expose the shadows hiding behind the airline's polished exterior. Mr. Kessel, please proceed, said the chair of the regulatory panel, his voice echoing slightly in the hushed, wood-paneled hearing room. Darian Kessel rose calmly from his seat at the center of the floor, adjusting the lapels of his dark suit. The nameplate before him gleamed under the overhead lights. Darian Kessel, CEO, Averon Systems. Behind him sat several of the passengers from Flight 318. Their faces familiar, some solemn, some quietly proud. Ahead, a semicircle of Air and Field regulatory directors waited, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and suppressed anger. The atmosphere felt surgical, no theatrics, just scalpel-precise scrutiny. Darian placed both hands on the edge of the wooden table. On October 24th, aboard Velora Air Flight 318, I was physically assaulted and publicly humiliated by a crew member named Corvin Reddar. He began, voice steady. But this hearing, I believe, is not just about one man's misconduct. It's about what allowed him to believe he could act with impunity. The panel listened in silence. One director, a stern man with silver temples and a name tag reading Darren Vale, interlocked his fingers as Darian spoke. Another, younger and more anxious-looking, scribbled notes with shaking fingers. A large digital display behind them flicked through freeze frames from the incident, images of Corvin dragging Darian's collar, the human wall of passengers, the service cart collision. Every frame was a blow against the lone wolf defense Velora's legal team had tried to advance just an hour earlier. Darian continued, drawing in a breath. What I endured was not random. The footage, Witness statements and internal records all confirm the presence of a reactivated profiling system called the Selective Passenger Protocol, a system previously banned, yet somehow it found its way back onto our aircraft, quietly, illegally, and weaponized. A murmur ran through the public gallery. From the side row, Elend Marin sat upright, arms crossed. His posture spoke volumes. Composed but unyielding. He had testified earlier in the morning, calmly dismantling Velora's procedural claims with the precision of someone who had built the very rules being broken. The chairman raised a hand. "Mr. Kessel, are you asserting this program was active company-wide?" Darien nodded slightly. Not necessarily company-wide, but it was authorized by someone in power. Supervisors like Haldren Voss. He gestured to the projection screen, now displaying Voss's signed approval logs, knowingly directed staff to flag passengers based on a defunct behavior algorithm that had been deemed discriminatory and volatile. That system placed me in Corvin's path. The young director's pen stopped mid-word. Darien leaned in slightly. "I didn't board that flight to provoke change. I boarded it to do my job. But when a man in uniform decided I didn't look like someone who belonged in seat 3A, I had a choice. Shrink or stand. I chose the latter, and thanks to the passengers who filmed, the evidence stood with me." Dramatic irony simmered through the room. Velora's representatives, 3 suited men across the room, shifted uncomfortably. One of them whispered to the other, eyes glued to a document in his lap. The image behind them now showed Corvin's face mid-scream, frozen in disbelief as he slid toward the service cart. "And what of accountability?" Darien asked aloud, breaking the tension. "What message do we send if we allow systems like this to survive under a new name, hidden in code, justified by fear, or dismissed as one man's mistake?" Director Vale cleared his throat. "We've reviewed all provided data. We've also verified the suspended logs regarding the protocol. Mr. Kessel, your testimony is not just compelling. It's damning." The vote was called immediately after. 12 raised hands. Unanimous. The room didn't cheer, but the stillness broke into quiet breaths of relief. The chairman declared the Selective Passenger Protocol permanently dismantled. Haldren Voss and 3 other supervisors were officially suspended pending further inquiry. Velora Air would undergo a full ethics overhaul, monitored quarterly for 2 years. Then came the surprise. Elend Marin rose from his chair and turned toward the panel. "I request to be appointed as Senior Advisory Overseer for the reform process," he said. "And I request one man to join me." All eyes turned. "Mr. Darien Kessel," Elend continued, "has demonstrated not only restraint under fire but clarity in crisis. He's not here because he wanted a seat at the table. He's here because someone tried to take that seat from him. I believe that makes him the best candidate to ensure it never happens again." Darien blinked, caught off guard. For a moment, the room held its breath. Then Darien stood. "If that's the role that builds a better system," he said, voice low but resolute, "then I accept." Outside, the afternoon sun cast sharp shadows across the marble steps. Reporters surged forward, flashes erupting like static. Microphones were raised, names called, questions hurled into the air. But Darien Kessel paused at the edge of the steps. He faced the cameras, adjusting the cuffs of his suit. And then, with a calm smile, not triumphant, but resolute, he said simply, "Dignity should never depend on status, race, or seat number." He turned and walked into the light. Darien understood that the story did not end when Corvin fell down the aisle. It began when justice finally stood upright. He tried to drag the CEO, and ended up dragged down the aisle himself, recorded for all to see. If you believe real authority turns tables instantly, subscribe now, because justice always finds its audience. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights racism, abuse of authority, and the consequences of underestimating someone's power and composure. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, accountability, and respect for every passenger.